I want to thank everyone for being here today, and thank Sarah for her comments also and the work that she's done to get the Sanctions Kill Coalition going. This coalition started in late 2019. And, as we were meeting and talking and planning, and we initially did a number of really excellent webinars, bringing people from around the world to speak about their countries, what we realized is, we need to, sanctions can be feel like kind of a complicated issue that people don't really understand. And I think many people don't understand the link between the economic warfare that the US wages abroad and the economic warfare that we experience here in the US. And so we felt like, well, there's got to be a way that we can reach folks and give them, the tools that they need to understand, what is actually going on here. And so we thought, oh, well, maybe if we made a sample presentation with a script, this would be something that people could use to educate themselves and others. And the way the toolkit is structured, it's a PowerPoint presentation, and it has a script that goes with it. It's very basic. It just gives the basics of, what sanctions are, who they impact, those kinds of things. But it's a tool that you can use and you can modify. So if you, depending on what your audience is, depending on what your interest is, depending on how in depth you want to go, there are a lot of resources on the sanctionskill.org website. We're also organizing those resources by country, so you can, or region, so you can start to get that as well. You can take this. This is our gift to you, and you can take it and you can modify it and use it however you think is the most strategic for the group that you're talking to. But we really just want this to get out there widely for people to use in their communities, their organizations, whatever, just to start raising this awareness that these exist, that they are as deadly as dropping bombs, and that we have to build a groundswell of public opinion against these sanctions if we're going to be able to influence the US government to end these illegal practices. So that's the purpose. And if you have questions, we'll answer those at the end. But also as we go forward, and this will be this is being recorded, so it will be available on the website as well. If there are things that you need, you want to do this presentation, and you need something, just please reach out to us, and we'll be happy to assist you, because this is your key. Your key in spreading the word and building this groundswell. So with that, let me go ahead and start the sample presentation. It takes about 20 minutes. And then we'll take Q&A at the end. So here we go. Okay. All right. So in this presentation, I'll talk about the tactic of economic warfare, which is commonly referred to as sanctions, that the United States is using around the world. I'll cover what sanctions are, who they impact, and how they're related to the economic war being waged against the population at home. I'll conclude with actions that can be taken to end this economic war. If I can get to the next slide. Up. It's not advancing. Give me one moment. Try that again. Okay, here we go. All right, so what are sanctions? Technically, they're commercial and financial penalties applied by one or more countries against another government, group, or individual. They can include restrictions on trade, as the United States has imposed on Iran, Cuba, North Korea, Syria, Zimbabwe, and 14 other countries. These trade restrictions often prohibit countries, including non-sanctioned countries, from also trading with the targeted country. So that's a form of secondary sanction. If they don't do that, they risk being sanctioned themselves. Sanctions can take the form of blocked financial transactions, not allowing financial institutions to process them. And this prevents a government, group, or individual from doing business, buying goods or services outside of the country. A government can also freeze the assets of another country or entity, as the United States did to Venezuela in August 2019 in an executive order signed by President Trump that said, all property and interests in property of the government of Venezuela that are in the United States are blocked and may not be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or otherwise dealt in. A government can also sanction by reducing foreign aid that's typically given, as the US did to Palestine, stopping its funding for the United Nations Palestinian Relief. It can also block loans through US-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. And the Global Magnitsky Act of 2016 allows the US government to block travel to the United States or revoke the US visa of any person the US deems as a human rights violator or corrupt. And this has been used against individuals from China, Russia, Ukraine, and other countries. I don't know why this isn't advancing. Let me try it again. I'm just going to go through like this so that everyone can see them. There we go. Okay. So as we all said, the U.S. imposed sanctions are a form of economic warfare. And but the idea of using economic sanctions against another country has been sold to the people in the United States as a more humane tactic than a military invasion. And this is false. Like other forms of warfare, sanctions are used to give the US an economic advantage over other countries. An example is the US sanctions that target China's technology firms, such as Huawei. Most often, the US uses sanctions as a tool to overthrow governments it doesn't support. The goal is to impose economic hardship on a country, or quote unquote, make the economy scream, as they said about Chile, claim the government of that country is responsible for the hardship, and encourage the population to rise up in protest against its government. The manufactured and often US-supported opposition is used to justify more US intervention to demand that the government step down, or a coup may be conducted. Sanctions are also used as retaliation to undermine the efforts of countries to move toward more independence or develop non-capitalist economies. And also, sanctions were used on members of the International Criminal Court in retaliation for proceeding with an investigation of US war crimes in Afghanistan. But sanctions are war. They are just as deadly as bullets and bombs, but the damage and deaths are not as visible to those who are outside the country. Sanctions kill by destroying economies, causing hyperinflation and unemployment so people can't afford basic necessities. They drive capital flight from countries as corporations and financial institutions seek to distance themselves and avoid being targeted by sanctions. As industries move elsewhere or can't get the materials they need, jobs are lost. Basic infrastructure may be harmed as funds and expertise are lost. Sanctions prevent countries within the region from working together or trading, and even if a country has the funds to purchase basic goods, they're blocked from making the financial transactions or importing them. One study found that sanctions contributed to 40,000 deaths in Venezuela between 2017 and 2018. Another study found sanctions contributed to the deaths of 4,000 North Koreans in 2018, and the vast majority were children and pregnant women. In the early 1990s, US sanctions against Iraq led to the deaths of as many as 880,000 children under 5 due to malnutrition and disease. Sanctions are illegal. The ones that are imposed by the United States violate international laws and the US Constitution. Technically, the sanctions that are imposed by the United States are not sanctions. They're unilateral coercive measures, because sanctions imply that there was a legal process employed that found a country, a group, or an individual in violation of a law, and then that entity was punished using sanctions. What the United States is doing mostly operates outside that process. The economic war is applied unilaterally. When the United States does use a legal process, such as through the United Nations, the US applies pressure on other countries to achieve its desired result. But some impacted countries are starting to challenge the unilateral coercive measures in court. In October 2018, Iran won a case against the United States in the United Nations International Court of Justice. The ICJ doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, and so the U.S. Didn't comply with that, but it was still an important decision. And currently, Venezuela has a case before the International Criminal Court charging the United States with crimes against humanity for the suffering and death of its coercive measures. And the justification is that this is a collective punishment, which is illegal. In terms of the United States Constitution, the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution declares that international laws are to be considered equal to an act of legislature. But while that's the spirit of it, there have been changes so that there are limits on that practice. But in the spirit of our Constitution, these sanctions or unilateral coercive measures violate our own Constitution. So how does the United States impose sanctions? Well, the first step in the sanctions process is often that the White House declares a country a threat to U.S. national security or designates a foreign entity a terrorist group. There's usually no evidence to back this claim, or the evidence is manufactured. This then triggers the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that allows the U.S. Treasury to impose economic sanctions. Congress and the State Department can also impose sanctions on countries, such as the recent NICA Act targeting Nicaragua, or against individuals, such as travel bans that prevent United Nations diplomats from participating in UN meetings. The United Nations Security Council has the authority to impose sanctions on countries or specific entities, and the United States is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, where it wields tremendous power over that UN sanctions process. But that power may be starting to wane somewhat. In 2020, the US attempted to extend a weapons embargo against Iran, but the members of the UN Security Council voted overwhelmingly against it, arguing the US had lost its standing when it pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement. And that was a pretty courageous act, I think, of these countries to come together and stand up to the United States in that way. So what countries are sanctioned? The United States is currently sanctioning 39 countries, representing 1/3 of the global population. As the list under the map demonstrates, 1/3 of the countries are African nations. The majority of sanctioned countries are predominantly non-white and are in the global south. In addition to countries, over 6,300 people are on the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets sanctioned list. To get sanctions lifted, countries must agree to the United States demands for austerity, for elections that meet the United States approval, or other economic and political concessions. This is why the sanctions are actually unilateral coercive measures, which are illegal. So who's affected by sanctions? Well, when the United States government says that sanctions exempt necessities such as food and medicine, and often claims that the sanctions impact governments or other officials, the reality is that it's the civilian population, especially women, children, the elderly, and those who have health conditions who are impacted the most. As I'll outline in more detail, sanctions weaken economies, cause unemployment and inflation, prevent the import of necessities such as food, medicines, and equipment to keep infrastructure and industries running, and prevent trade and travel. So let's look at health. Perhaps one of the most egregious effects of unilateral coercive measures or sanctions are on the health of the population. Even when countries have the funds to purchase medications, they're unable to make the financial transaction to pay for them. For example, Venezuela has $1 billion worth of gold in the Central Bank of London that it intends to use to purchase necessities through the United Nations, but the United Kingdom is refusing to release it. Similarly, Venezuela had a fund through its oil company, Citgo, that it was using to pay for bone marrow transplants in Spain. But the United States seized Citgo, and so those patients have been left without the ability to get the care they need. And the Venezuelan pharmaceutical industry, which was once thriving, has been decimated because Venezuela can't import the precursors it needs to manufacture medications. Additionally, sanctioned countries are unable to import medical supplies and equipment. They're forced to reuse single-use supplies. They have shortages of fuel, which prevent the transport of patients, and basic infrastructure that provides power and water may not function well. Shortages of food, water, and power impact the general health of the population, And we know, for example, that more children die of infectious diseases, especially diarrheal diseases, when they lack access to clean water. And finally, sanctioned countries have more barriers to research. Their scientists can't purchase scientific books from abroad or travel to conferences. They can't collaborate with institutions in other countries. In reality, sanctions imposed on other countries impact the health of people in the United States because we don't have access to the medical innovations developed in sanctioned countries, and we can't benefit from medical collaboration. For example, Cuba is sending doctors around the world to help provide care and support for healthcare systems. Another egregious impact of sanctions is the shortage of food. The most obvious reason is the inability to import food because banks won't process the financial transactions. But even if a sanctioned country is able to make that financial transaction, often the food can't be transported because the insurance companies that would insure the vessel refuse to do that because they're afraid that they're going to be hit with sanctions. Sanctions also harm agricultural institutions. There are shortages of seeds and inputs for farming, as well as fuel to run farm machinery and transport food. And as Omowale said in his comments, in Zimbabwe, it was when the people took action to reclaim their land, which had been promised to them, that the US started imposing damaging sanctions on them. Food shortages and the economic devastation from sanctions that create hyperinflation raise the price of food, while at the same time unemployment makes it difficult for families to afford adequate food. So most of the food insecure nations in the world are sanctioned countries. Water is also essential for life, and sanctions have a negative impact on access to clean water, resulting in hardship and disease. The major reasons sanctions prevent access to clean water are the inability of a country to import parts to keep its water infrastructure operating, and shortages of fuel to keep the infrastructure such as water and sewage treatment plants operating, and also the pumps that deliver the water to homes or to buildings also need to be powered. Sanctions impact education at every level, from the lack of resources to keep schools open and operating to the inability to import basic supplies such as pencils and books. Students are blocked from using online tools and computer software if they live in a sanctioned country because corporations don't want to risk penalties for potentially violating the sanctions. Sanctions can also prevent students from attending school. They may not be allowed to study abroad, or even if they're accepted for study abroad, they're unable to pay for the education because banks won't process the transactions. The economic hardship and food shortages caused by sanctions may also cause children to leave school as they need to go to work or help their families with food production. And when I was on a peace delegation in Iran in early 2019, we met with the students at the University of Tehran, and they were in an American Studies program, but they couldn't get books to do, those American studies. They couldn't access, books from the United States. That's just one example. Okay. There we go. Sanctions have a negative impact on energy. They prevent the importation of fuel and parts to run power plants, as well as the importation of power from neighboring countries, as we're seeing right now with Iraq and Iran. Sanctions also decrease access to parts to maintain the electrical grid. And even in countries with large fossil fuel resources, such as Venezuela and Iran, sanctions prevent them from importing the materials and equipment needed to keep their drilling and refinery equipment in order so they can use those fossil fuels. Right now in Venezuela, they're having a severe crisis with not having enough oil. And that's in a country that has the most oil reserves in the world. So reduced access to oil and gas impact the entire transportation infrastructure of sanctioned countries, but so does the inability to import parts and tools to keep cars, trucks, buses, and trains running. For example, in Cuba, because they can't import the cars are kept running for many decades using whatever is available, and cars are passed down through families. In Venezuela, due to the fuel shortage, as I just said, people are waiting in line for days to fill their car with gas. The negative impact of sanctions on transportation have a broad impact on the ability to move people and goods around the country, which ripples out to impact farmers, manufacturers, and businesses. Sanctions also worsen unemployment in targeted countries through a variety of mechanisms. Even during the pre-sanction period, when a country is designated a national security threat, investors and corporations see what's coming and they may leave the country. This capital flight causes a loss of jobs. Hyperinflation makes the price of goods rise and decreases people's ability to purchase them, which may cause businesses to go bankrupt and shut down. The lack of investment capital, as well as the inability to import needed supplies and equipment, leads industries to weaken or shut down altogether, also causing a loss of jobs. Barriers to trade with other countries mean producers of food and other goods have a smaller market to sell to, which adversely impacts them. And finally, the effects of sanctions on transportation may mean that producers can't get their goods to the market, even if it does exist. Sanctions create real hardship for people and may drive them to leave their home country. When an economy is destroyed and people can't meet their basic needs, or unemployment is high, or there's violence as a result of unrest, people often feel they have no choice but to emigrate. This can lead to brain drain, as those who have the financial resources to leave are, the ones that leave the country. And perhaps this could be professors, people in medicine, people in engineering. And this compounds the hardships as there's fewer people to provide the needed expertise to keep the country running. Just talking briefly about sanctions in the COVID-19 pandemic. In the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic led to a global call for peace and international cooperation to stop the spread of disease and ensured nations had what they needed to protect the health of their people. There were calls from international bodies such as the United Nations to end sanctions because of their impacts on food and health. The United States rejected this call for cooperation and instead dropped out of the World Health Organization, increased the sanctions against countries such as Iran and Venezuela, and continued its military aggression. And it is notable that President Biden has rejoined the World Health Organization, but if you read their section on that in the COVID-19 plan, part of their goal is to be able to take control of the World Health Organization, or the US needs to lead it again. The United States also failed to provide the basics for its own people during the pandemic. It should be no surprise that a government that has no regard for the lives of people abroad would show the same disregard for its own population. And sanctions also harm people here in the United States. There are numerous ways that this happens. An obvious one is the restrictions on trade that prevent businesses in the US from doing business with sanctioned countries. For example, US farmers can't export their products. They also prevent imports to the US from sanctioned countries. In an effort for other countries to circumvent the sanctions, they're finding new ways to do business that exclude US dollars and exclude financial institutions that are constrained by the United States. So this is leading to an isolation of the United States and a de-dollarization of the global economy. Economic warfare against other countries may destabilize them, leading to violence and threats to global security. But in some places, the economic measures create greater solidarity within the impacted country as people unite to oppose a common enemy, the United States. Restrictions on the sharing of information and collaboration with entities in other countries stifles innovation, prevents people in the US from benefiting from new technology in sanctioned countries. And economic warfare drives migration as people seek employment and escape from instability. The blame for migration is often put on the person who is migrating instead of on the circumstances that force them to leave their country. And in the US, migrants are often falsely blamed for economic insecurity that people here experience. So they become a scapegoat that divides the working class against each other instead of uniting against the common causes of this insecurity, an economic system that serves the wealthy and a foreign policy of domination. The economic war that people experience in the United States is similar to what people experience in sanctioned countries. The same neoliberal economic policies that the US imposes on countries around the world are imposed on people within the United States. These take the form of a for-profit healthcare system that leaves tens of millions of people without health insurance. And even for tens of millions of people who have health insurance, they're underinsured. They can't afford to get care because of the high out-of-pocket costs. The United States has a severe lack of affordable housing. Public education is underfunded, and higher education is not available to everyone who seeks it. Wages are low, and most people don't have a secure retirement. Infrastructure in the US is failing due to a lack of investment in its upkeep. And this is being used as an excuse to privatize everything from public housing to the postal service to water, the internet, schools, etc. As one of the wealthiest nations in the world, the United States can afford to provide these services to its people. And indeed, the government has an obligation to provide these basic services that it's failing to meet. It's the same ideology that drives the economic war abroad and at home. And the answer to this is people-centered human rights approach that's rooted in the self-determination of communities and struggle against the power holders who value profits over human life and a livable future. So finally, it's time for people around the world to unite and demand an end to the economic wars being waged at home and abroad. And so we invite you to join the Sanctions Kill campaign. If you go to the website sanctionskill.org, on the right-hand side, you'll see the call to action that you can endorse as an individual or an organization. That puts you on the email list so that we can keep in touch with you. We currently have a petition going that you can sign. There's a legislative action page that you can use to contact your member of Congress. And then we also organize actions, days of action, that you can participate in as well. So I'll stop there. At the end of the script that we provide on the Sanctions Kill website at sanctionskill.org/toolkit, there's also a list of resources, but there are also a tremendous amount of resources at the website itself.